Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Wild, Wild Death, the show where we talk about all the ways people took their final expedition to the high mountain in the Old West. Each week, we spin the wagon wheel of untimely demise, and whatever manner of death it lands on, we tell you a story about it. My name is Jack James Busa.
I'm Leslie Sadali.
And I'm Susan Busa Leshner. So, the high mountain, that is the final place to go.
Yeah.
The final resting
The
place.
final expedition to the high mountain, baby. We figure it all out on the other side, but in the meantime, we make horrible decisions which inevitably lead us there.
In the spirit of this, why don't we spin the wagon wheel of untimely demise?
Here we go. Spinning. Let's see where it stops. Okay. Mode of death today is assassination.
Ooh.
Guess who has a story about this? Me!
Me too.
I was gonna say that.
All right, let's get started. Charles Bent was the kind of guy who was always in the right place at the right time, making the right choices. He grew up in St. Louis at the very start of America's expansion west. And that's where he met the right people, started making those right choices, and he made himself rich in the process. Everything Charles Bent touched turned to gold, and his ambitions were rewarded with a position of power. But maybe all this success gave Charles Bent the illusion that he was infallible, because on a cold January day in 1847, he was, finally, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with no idea of what was coming to his front door. This story is called The Death of Charles Bent.
Whoa. This sounds
Okay.
very like Lynchian. Like everything was perfect until it
Well.
wasn't. Clang, clang, clang went the trolley.
All right. Charles Bent was born on November 11th, 1799 in Charleston, Virginia, which is now West Virginia, into a prominent family of lawyers and judges. Shortly after the end of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1806, the Bent family moved to St. Louis, Missouri. Charles's father, Judge Silas Bent, was a surveyor who helped define Missouri's western boundaries, and he later served as a territorial judge and then as a presiding justice on the Missouri Supreme Court. As a result, Charles grew up around all the movers and shakers of St. Louis during the early days of the fur trade. His family sent him east for his education, but it wasn't long until Charles returned to Missouri. His real ambition was to succeed in the West, not as a politician, but as a trader, because out on the frontier, law books didn't mean much. Buffalo hides and black powder were the currency of power, and Charles Bent was determined to build an empire from it. In 1820, when Charles was 21, he joined the American Fur Company trading along the upper Missouri. But by 1830, he was ready to branch out on his own. He and his younger brother William Bent partnered with Sirin St. Vrain, a French-American trader, and they formed a mercantile partnership called Bent, St. Vrain and Company. They were very successful. About 3 years after forming the partnership, they constructed Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River in what is now southeastern Colorado. And this place was huge. It was less like a fort and more like an adobe fortress. And there's pictures online if you want to take a look at it. And this place also sat on the Santa Fe Trail between Missouri and Mexico. So it quickly became a multicultural hub, a place where white traders and scouts and Mexican merchants, Plains Indian tribes, especially Cheyenne and Arapaho, U.S. military officers, and mountain men mingled.
Whoa.
Bent's Fort was more than a trading post. It was a hub of commerce, culture, and diplomacy. The Bent brothers traded buffalo robes, horses, and goods, and they also hosted peace councils with native tribes. Bent's Fort also became a stop for explorers like John C. Fremont, whose expeditions westward depended on its supplies and support. So if you remember our friend John,
Yeah.
might want to look at the episode called Freezing with Fremont.
He definitely needed supplies and support, that guy.
Yes, he
No
did.
kidding.
And advice that he would actually take. Bent's Fort was also a place of forced labor. Among its residents were two enslaved African Americans, Charlotte and Dick Green, and they were in the household of William Bent. And while they had no freedom, they did have a memorable presence. By all accounts, Charlotte was a fantastic cook, and she was kind of an entertainer. She was a really good dancer, and she had a great sense of humor, making a pretty big impression on everybody who was there. And her husband, Dick, was a skilled blacksmith. And they were indispensable to life at Bent's Fort. But it was their courage which put them in the history books, and we will come back to them later.
Oh. Geez, you give me a little hit, I want a little more.
Ominous.
It's good.
I like when people are courageous. Go on.
Charles, meanwhile, split his time between the fort, Santa Fe, and Taos, New Mexico. He hooked up with a local woman named Ignacia Jaramillo. Now, people viewed them as man and wife, but they were not legally married. As the area was part of Mexico, to be a citizen and to be able to get married meant you had to be Catholic.
Oh, wow.
Legendary scout Kit Carson also lived in Taos, and he converted before he married Ignacia's sister, Josefa. But Charles did not convert. He and Ignacia were in what we now call a common law marriage. And this was a strategic union that was helpful to Charles because Ignacia came from a prominent Mexican family. But by all accounts, Charles and Ignacia had also a loving partnership. They had 5 children, lived in a cozy little adobe home near the Taos Plaza and just 3 miles from the Taos Pueblo.
I like when characters from other stories we've told come into new stories we're telling. It's like when you're a kid and like the Harlem Globetrotters are on Scooby-Doo. It's really nice.
It's very similar at Bent's Fort. Very, very similar to
Yeah.
Charles.
It's satisfying. I'm like, what are you doing here, Kit Carson?
In 1846, the Mexican-American War broke out. Luckily for the United States side of the conflict, Bent's Fort was in a perfect place for the U.S. Army to store supplies as they got ready to march on Santa Fe. It was big, and it was in just the right location. The U.S. Army was prepared for a fight, but the Mexican governor in Santa Fe pretty much gave up right away. So, on August 18th, the Army, under Colonel Stephen Kearny, entered Santa Fe without having to fire a shot. And just like that, the people of New Mexico became citizens of the United States.
Wow. Go off, Colonel Kearney.
Well, they had stored all their guns there ready to roll, and they didn't have to do anything with it. So Kearny didn't waste any time setting up the 3 branches of government, imposing taxes, and separating the church from the state in the new territory. Now remember, church and state were very intertwined, and you had to be a Catholic in order to even really be a full citizen of the area. But now you sort of did the United States thing and separated church from state. But even though there had not been a battle when he took over the area, that did not mean the New Mexican people were happy about it. For one thing, they were worried if they'd be able to keep the titles to their lands. They were concerned that this was going to wind up being a big land grab because, the United States never does that.
No, that's so not us.
Yeah. And the old order, the way of doing things, was just suddenly upended by the American takeover. This was a lot of change in a short period of time for the peoples of the region. We're talking about, traditions that are centuries old,
Yeah.
and suddenly it's all over.
Wow. That would freak me out.
Yeah, it would.
Sure.
On top of that, Kearney appointed Bent to be the region's territorial governor. Now, this probably seemed like a good idea to him because Bent was a kind of an important guy in the region and he was connected. But back in Washington, this was viewed as a terrible idea
Why?
because they probably wanted a military person in the spot instead of a civilian.
Right.
Like we just sort of, gained control of the area and it was so easy. Don't be fooled. But they went ahead and put Bent in. He was well connected. He was fluent in local customs and he was bilingual and married into a respected Taos family. So it seems like a good idea
Yeah.
to Colonel Kearney. So Bent was sworn in as governor of the newly occupied territory, and Kearney went on his way to his next mission in California. The territory was now part of the U.S., and it was just so easy peasy for that to happen. And the guy who was in with everyone in the area was governor. So this is all going to be great. Plus, making Bent governor may have been a big thank you for allowing the U.S. Army to store their guns in his fort.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. He did like service to the government, and here you go. I think this makes total sense.
Everything seemed to be progressing smoothly, but behind the calm was a deep unrest. To many New Mexicans, Hispano settlers, Pueblo leaders, and priests, Bent was no longer a neighbor. He was a collaborator, a traitor, a man who had thrown in with the invaders and turned his back on the people.
Oh, I didn't think about that part.
Yeah. They were angry about land seizures and military arrogance, the erosion of centuries-old rights under Spanish and Mexican law, and that anger boiled over. Now, there was a plot that was discovered. They were going to sort of overthrow Bent as the governor, but they just discovered it before anything could really happen. So they threw all the people in jail, and they thought, that's all done and dusted. Everything's good. Bent was so confident about that he traveled from Santa Fe to Taos without a military escort. It's all good for me. So he was very surprised when on the morning of January 19th, 1847, the rebellion came crashing through Governor Bent's front door.
Oh,
Bent was home with Ignacia, her sister Josefa, and the children when a mob of insurgents, which are Taos Pueblo warriors and Mexican rebels, broke down the door, surprising Bent and his family. They shot Bent with arrows and scalped him in front of his family before they left.
whoa! Bet you weren't expecting that today.
No, but Bent was really a tough guy. He was still alive after all of that.
How?
After being scalped?
After being
Yeah.
scalped? Jeez.
Well, it just takes off the top part of your skin.
Oh, is that all?
He was alive right then. Didn't mean he would stay alive, but he was still alive then.
Whoa.
So in order to get to safety, Ignacia and their servants quickly dug a hole through the adobe wall of their home and into the connecting house.
Pause. What? I would never think to do that. I would never go, we need out. We're going to dig a hole. Doesn't that take a long time?
Here in Texas, it would. This hard ground.
Well, they're not digging a hole in the ground. They're digging a hole through the wall to the next house, and it's through adobe, not through modern day sheetrock and 2x4s. And just think how quickly you could work, especially if you had a number of people to dig a hole through the wall if you felt like your life was at stake and you were trapped. What they did was they dug this hole, and then they ducked through the hole into the connecting house, dragging Bent with them.
Wow.
They tried to tend to Bent's wounds, but the rebels came back.
horror movie.
They figured out that Bent was in the neighbor's house, and they brutally killed him, finishing him off.
Oh,
But they allowed the women and the children to live. The same day, rebels also killed other American officials and traders across the territory.
whoa.
In response to the revolt, this other U.S. person, Colonel Price, led U.S. forces into Taos and besieged San Geronimo Church, where dozens of insurgents, including civilians, were killed. And let me just sort of tell you, this is a story all its own. They brought in these guns, they brought in these cannons. There was this massive church made out of adobe, and they fired in the church where there was about 200 people inside, including women and children. And they hammered away on that church for hours and hours, before they finally got a hole. And then they put in hot shrapnel and killed everybody inside.
Wow. It's horrible.
Yeah, it's horrible. You can see, usually when you hear this story, and then we fought back and it's good, but when you get down to the nitty gritty of what they did, nobody's good here.
No.
So they were killed in the San Geronimo Church, and then rebel leaders were swiftly tried in a trial that really wasn't fair, because one of the judges was related to somebody who had been killed by the rebels. And they were tried, and about 16 of them were publicly hanged in Taos Plaza.
16?
Yeah, the rebel leaders were tried, and they were publicly hanged in Taos Plaza, right near the spot where Bent had died.
Wow.
By this time, word of Charles Bent's assassination had reached William Bent at Bent's Fort. Remember Dick Green and Charlotte Green?
How could I forget?
When this military column formed to suppress the revolt, Dick Green, the enslaved man who had labored for years at the fort as a blacksmith, volunteered to join. He participated in the assault on Taos Pueblo in February 1847. This is where the insurgents had barricaded himself inside the San Geronimo Church. And though he was wounded in the battle, he survived. And in recognition of his service, William Bent granted Dick and Charlotte their freedom.
Whoa.
Their manumission was one of the few recorded acts of emancipation directly tied to military service in the American West. There's other stories. The guy that went with Lewis and Clark, and he did all of this work, and he was with them on the whole expedition, and when he got back, William Clark wouldn't free him. So these guys actually got rewarded. And Dick and Charlotte's story, preserved through oral histories and court records, is a powerful example of enslaved African Americans who actually helped shape the outcome of Western expansion and their own destinies through courage and their own agency.
Yeah.
Charles Bent's family remained in Taos, and his widow never remarried.
Wow.
The house was repaired, and today it's a museum. And if you go to Taos, you can go in this house and see the hole that they dug.
I want to see
Wow.
that hole. This story is really kind of sad, because it's like the aftershocks of war just creating more war. There was, this
Yeah.
guy was like fine in his community, rewarded with this title, but then the people in the town were like, well, dude, this title, like, I don't like this. So then they come in and they create more
Right.
violence, and then everyone reacts to that violence. And then,
Yeah.
Charlotte and Dick are also rewarded for like fighting. It's just like all these weird like rewards for violence.
Some of these are just so awful at points that it really leaves you speechless, you know?
Well, yeah. But here we are talking about it.
No, I know.
And I think it's kind of important to remember our history. Hopefully, so we don't repeat it again, but that's the goal.
Yeah.
Bent's Fort declined after the uprising. Now, the fur trade was waning anyway, but the trauma of Charles's murder cast a long shadow. And by 1849, the original fort was pretty much abandoned. Now, there is a reconstructed version that stands as a National Historic Site, and they preserve the stories of trade, cross-cultural negotiation, and slavery and survival on the 19th century frontier. And we'll put a link to that because it's quite the space. It really is. During his lifetime, Charles Bent achieved every goal of wealth and power he set for himself. He was a successful businessman. He was a diplomatic negotiator, a governor, a loving husband and father. He was also a man who married into an elite Mexican family to boost his business, and a frontier capitalist who built a trading empire and bridged cultures, yet benefited from systems of conquest and slavery. But finally, Charles Bent was a politician espousing unification who became a lightning rod for rebellion and murdered in his own home by people who viewed him as a traitor. His death exposed the fault lines of American expansion, where manifest destiny met indigenous resistance, and personal will was not enough to hold an empire together. Today, Bent is remembered not only as the first American governor of New Mexico, but also as a symbol of the cost of colonial ambition. And in the end, Charles Bent was a man caught between cultures and a casualty of his ambitions and the grinding wheel of westward expansion.
If you'd like to know more about the history behind this episode, please check out the links in our show notes and follow us on social media at thewildwilddeath.com.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.
Adios, muchachas.
The Wild Wild Death is a production of 2222 Media.